Thank you for coming to the Dissertation Club. This will be the last live session. I would like to welcome Caroline Brown, a former MSc Corporate Governance and Business Ethics student. Caroline will showcase her dissertation, Are We Really Any Good at Doing Good? Impact Assessment as a Measure of Effectiveness in 2 UK Charities. Caroline's dissertation was highly recommended by Sue Konzelman. It is an excellent piece of work, relevant, powerful, and well researched. Caroline will take us through the major sections of her dissertation. Students are encouraged to ask questions at any point. Caroline has graciously allowed us to see her work. You'll find a link to this dissertation below this video in the description section.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I was very surprised to be invited to do this, but I'm really happy to do it. I remember when I was finishing my dissertation, how useful the Birkbeck resources were. So I'm really glad to be able to do my bit to help you guys. Ryan sent me a kind of framework for how you want this session to run. And Ryan, have we got an hour? Is that right?
Yes, we have an hour.
So I'm going to follow what Ryan has asked me to do, and just please, if anybody wants to stop me or ask a question as I'm going, please let Ryan know and we can do that. So the first question he asked me to address was how I formulated my research question. And I'm going to say right from the outset, I found that really quite hard. And I found it hard because I had a general idea what I wanted to research, and that was about how charities are able to assess the work that they do and the impact that they have. But it was quite difficult to pin it down into something that I could actually do research about. And I got quite caught up in things like the terminology, so the difference between performance measurement and impact assessment and the various different aspects of performance measurement and organizational performance, and whether that's different from performance measurement. So it was a really kind of tricky thing to hone down into a question, and actually I changed it several times. And I'll also say that my first dissertation proposal, which went to Sue, who was my supervisor, was actually quite different from the research that I ended up doing and the research question. And one of the reasons for that was, I think I was trying to be a bit too clever originally when I was formulating my research question. And when I simplified it and actually thought really hard about what it was I wanted to get out of the research, it became a little bit easier. So I would say don't worry too much in the beginning about trying to get your research question right. It took me quite a long time to get to the stage when I was happy with it. And actually, that wasn't until I was some way into the literature review. Doing the literature review really helped me understand what it was I wanted to look at, and also where the gaps in the research were. So it was a kind of ongoing process of defining my research question, having looked at the literature that was out there already and the research that had been done. I've got a few notes here, so bear with me for a minute. In terms of the, I'm going to skip over the abstract because I don't think that's very important. In terms of the introduction then, so Ryan has said that I should talk about the introduction and the rationale and how I did the introduction. So basically, I wanted in the introduction to set the context and explain what I was trying to address with my research question. And for me, that meant looking at the context in which charities operate, the legal context particularly, because they have certain obligations to meet in order for them to show that they are benefiting society and meeting the needs of beneficiaries. In other words, having a public benefit. So I wanted to explain that and let the reader understand the extent to which that legal context is influences the way that they work and how they actually look at their own performance and how they're able to demonstrate through their performance and their impact assessment that they're meeting their obligations as a charity. So I wanted to set all that out in the introduction, which I think I managed to do. So there was the legal context, what they're required to do in order to show that they are achieving a public benefit, and that's some of the requirements there. And I finished this section with a little bit of a statement about the extent to which they are able to do that and not able to do that, and this particular link between the relationship between a charity's purpose and public benefit, which one is one of the main things that I wanted to look at actually. It was quite useful in doing this section that I'd found 1 or 2 systematic reviews in my literature review, because and I would really recommend anybody, if you can find a systematic review that another researcher or another set of researchers have done into something similar to the question that you're trying to answer, you might well find some interesting contextual information to help you. And also very often you'll get a whole source of reading material from those systematic reviews. I certainly found that really interesting and useful when I was doing my introductory section. Ryan, is this kind of along the lines of the things you want me to talk about?
Perfect, Caroline, perfect.
Okay.
And if you have any questions, anybody, you can ask, just feel free to ask and I'll pass the questions on to Caroline.
I think, to be honest, the introduction and rationale is one of the things when you're actually writing up, you'll probably do quite late on in the writing up of your dissertation. It's a kind of, you will be clearer about what you want to say in your introduction when you finish your research. So I wouldn't get hung up about writing up your dissertation in the order that it appears in the final document. The literature review, I'm going to talk a little bit longer about, because actually I found the literature review really quite difficult. I hadn't done any academic study for years. I'm a very mature student, so was used to reading in my work, which is predominantly in regulation and investigations, was used to reading a lot of evidence-based material, but really unused to reading academic papers, academic studies. And it took me quite a while to get into the swing of doing that. Even though I'd had to do that a lot in the course of my study at Birkbeck, while in the period leading up to my master's, with the various different modules I did, I found it quite a different experience when I was actually trying to do it to get data or to understand, what I needed to do for my dissertation. So quite challenging, but I mean, in the end, I managed it, and I think everybody does. So my literature review section explains that I looked at impact assessment as an aspect of organisational performance measurement, and it sets out how I wanted to develop my own understanding for the purpose of my research, but also that I was hoping to be able to identify a gap in the research or something that I could add to the research that had already been done in this area. Compared with some of my fellow students, actually, there wasn't an enormous amount of, I mean, I didn't find thousands of papers. I think other people sometimes have greater challenges than I did because there is so much material out there. Comparatively, there wasn't as much material. That said, I did have to kind of restrict what I was looking at, because otherwise you're just, it's very easy to get bogged down with hundreds and hundreds of papers. Moodle was brilliant. I really miss Moodle now because it was an enormously good source of information. So I loved Moodle. Google Scholar was also quite useful. And for me, I was doing a lot of this during COVID, at the beginning of COVID and during COVID. So it meant that I had no access to Birkbeck Library or indeed any other library. So my sources were largely academic papers, and it was Moodle and Google Scholar was where I managed to find those. And I printed an enormous amount of copies of papers. I like to work with paper. Probably something to do with my age. I had a lot of papers with a lot of scribbling, but that's what worked best for me. There was a lot of material, as I said. I think I cited 44 or 45 papers in my dissertation, but I probably looked at least twice that, if not more. There was a period when I kind of couldn't see the wood for the trees. I don't think that's uncommon. And trying to work my way through some of these very dense academic papers and understand at a very basic level whether they were offering anything to me in terms of my research, and if they were, what exactly it was was quite time consuming and difficult, and actually made me quite anxious at the time. But I think you just have to bear with it, go with it, and get into a kind of routine and the swing of it. And I did find that the more I read, the more I found repetition in what was being said, the easier it was to discount something because it wasn't directly relevant to what I was writing about, and the easier it was to find something that was kind of new or novel. And essentially I just kept a list of what I'd read, with a kind of few columns kind of ticking whether it was something that I had to go back to, whether it was telling me anything new, or you work out a little way of documenting what you've read, what you need to come back to, and the papers that you think you want to cite in your dissertation. And actually I started at quite an early stage in building my references. Oh my goodness, that's a really hard question, and and it seems an awfully long time ago now. So I'm trying to think when I started it. I handed it in. When would I have handed it in? Gosh, I can't. It did take a few months. I think I started in earnest. I mean, I know we were talking about it in the kind of September, October. I think I then started it in the January, February time, and I made myself a plan quite early on. So as soon as my academic studies, in terms of my modules, had finished, and I had some work to do because I did it in 18 months. So I was finishing off modules, which meant that I didn't actually start work on my dissertation until after the Christmas. But as soon as I didn't have assignments to do for other modules, I started, and I put myself a plan together, and I was quite generous with the time that I allowed for things like the literature review, which I knew would take me time to do because I knew I'd struggled with some of the papers that I'd had to read for my various different modules. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific. I should have looked up before I started to see exactly when I started and when I finished. I would do that now. You're seeing my screen, so you'll be seeing all my other stuff if I start going into my folders.
So that was fine. So after the data collection, America asked, so after the data collection right to the end, was that the shortest period, would you say? Like once you've done the data collection, the write-up stage, was that like the home straight for you?
So I find writing, I'm really comfortable with writing. So the writing was never a challenge for me. The things that were most challenging were the literature review and the analysis of the data, which I'll come on to in a minute. I found that those two were big chunks of work. Once I'd done those two things, then the writing wasn't such a big issue for me. And I did a first draft, which I then shared with my supervisor, who was enormously helpful. And I found that, I sent my supervisor a draft with questions saying, have I done enough of this? And she replied, I can't answer questions like that, which was very right and proper. So once I understood the sort of things that she could actually help me with, she was really, really helpful and supportive, and actually a great morale booster. I also had, and this might be useful to you guys, in one of my modules, I kind of budded up with another student who actually, she and I are now really close, good friends, and she was a real kind of project manager type and a real kind of motivational person, and we arranged kind of during lockdown, we arranged regular Zoom calls. We had them about every kind of in the beginning about once every 3 or 4 weeks, and then as we got nearer the time when we had to hand our work in, we were doing them once a fortnight and once a week, just to kind of talk through what we were doing, the objectives what we were setting ourselves for the next period, the challenges that we had, and we really kind of helped each other. And I found that, not being in college, I found that really useful. So if you can find somebody that you trust and that you can work with, and that you can kind of use as a bit of a sounding board, and to motivate each other, that I found that really helpful. I think what was interesting while I was doing the literature, when I started, I didn't really know what I was looking for. I had the basis of my question. I knew the article types that I needed to look for. So I had search terms, and I was using Boolean searches, and I was You know, I knew that I wanted to focus on the kind of last 20 years. I knew I wanted to, you know, there were things like that. Language was quite interesting. So I was having to search for charity as well as not for profit, as well as non-profit. So I did spend some time thinking about the terms that I should use to find the literature, to find the documents that I wanted to read. But as time went on, you know, as the days and the weeks passed, I found it much easier to quickly discard things and to identify the things I really needed to read and concentrate on. So it does get easier. And actually, the really good thing about my literature review for me was that I was able to kind of identify some themes which actually in the end formed the basis of my own analysis and gave me my framework. Well, she in terms of the content of my dissertation, obviously she we knew each other because I'd been in a class with her. I think I submitted a very early draft and then one more draft, I think, and she didn't comment on things like style or you know, she didn't say anything about that aspect of what I'd written. So I was asking her things like, there was one question I asked her, I wasn't quite sure about about the extent to which I should cover various things in my literature review. She was quite helpful about that. So because I was writing about a mode of performance assessment, I wasn't quite sure about how much my dissertation should include about that as a subject on its own for context. So she gave me really useful advice about that kind of thing. But she certainly wasn't kind of doing any kind of editing on or commenting on the quality of my writing. It was really to help me make sure that I was kind of sticking within the scope of my research question. I think that would be fair to say.
Excellent.
And she was really strict about some of the things that she wasn't able to, you know, if I asked her a question which she thought wasn't an appropriate one to be asking her in terms of, you know, her input into my dissertation, she would just say, I can't really, you're gonna have to work that one out yourself. And that's right. I mean, that is how it should be. So maybe I should give you a little bit of context. So I was not working for, but was and still am the trustee of a charity in the UK, which was really, we as a board of trustees were really kind of grappling with this whole notion of effectiveness, performance effectiveness, and performance management. Performance measurement, not management so much. We as an organisation were finding it quite hard to understand what more we could do to demonstrate to ourselves that we were having an impact in the area that we're in. And so that was what my initial motivation was. It was in my role as a trustee of a charity. I thought that would be a good thing to be looking at. And actually, I should have said right at the beginning of this, pick a subject that you're genuinely interested in. I'm sure people have said this to you already, but if you pick a subject which you don't have a genuine kind of authentic interest in and desire to find out more about, I think you're going to find this all the more difficult. Because I was interested in that subject and because I had I got a sense that the output of it would be useful to my organisation. It kind of made the work a lot more worthwhile to me personally. In terms of how I formulated the question, I've got my original dissertation proposal here, so you'll see, you know what the title of my dissertation was. Are we really any good at doing any good? Impact assessment as a measure of effectiveness in 2 UK charities. My original one, at risk of you all roaring with laughter, was how do we know we're any good at doing good? Is symbolic interpretivist perspective on impact assessment in the UK charity sector. And that is genuinely what I wanted to do originally. In one of my modules, which was perspective on organisations, I had learnt about different organisational theories, and I was fascinated by that. And that's actually what I wanted to do. I kind of wanted to understand how charities, which I did end up doing. I wanted to understand how charities themselves view their organisation and the work that they're doing. but I decided actually that trying to do it from a symbolic interpretive perspective didn't really help me very much, didn't get me very far, which is why in the end I came down to the question I settled on, which is really looking at how organizations do it, whether they think they're doing it well, whether they are doing it well, whether they can demonstrate that, and if they and how far it you know, the extent to which it actually shows that they're fulfilling their public benefit purpose, and that question seemed to encapsulate that for me. So in the end, I just simplified it for myself, and I don't regret having done that. I think that was absolutely the best thing to do.
Hello, my name is Dr. Thank you very much for this. Thank you very much for everyone for this. My question is about me specifically. I'll be very, very rapid. My supervisor, while he's a great person, is having difficulties understanding my dissertation. It's a coding dissertation. Should I just persevere, hope for the best, explain, or should I just try another approach? Thank you so much, and thank you.
I mean, the one thing I can say in response to that is I chose very early on that I was going to do a qualitative research study. I did the research for management module. I got a reasonable pass, but I never was going to do a quantitative research study. And my supervisor also, Sue Conselman, her research I think entirely has been qualitative research. So I was quite lucky in that respect. I mean, I don't know if your supervisors, if their own research background is using similar or different methodologies to yours, but maybe that's something to explore with them. I'm not sure I can answer that question. I think maybe that's one for you, Ryan, probably.
Thank you very much. Thank you very
much. I would say just another conversation with your supervisor needs to be had, and if there are limitations in his help that he's given to you, then maybe he could recommend some other course of action, some other support, and so and also I have a quantitative equivalent. Her name is Ava as well. So if you're not able to get advice from your supervisor, you could contact my colleague and maybe have a conversation with her as well about quantitative. So thank you
very much, sir. Thank you.
No worries. And I have a question from Oyit. How are you, Oyit?
Not too bad. Thank you so much for this, very enlightening. I've got a question in regards to the methodology section, and I just want to kind of understand your point of view in regards to if it's highly theoretical, say the methodology, and then you go to the data analysis section and you kind of have to analyze the data. Is there a point that you deviated slightly away, or was your methodology written in stone and implemented into the data section?
Yeah, okay. So in terms of my, I'm going to come back to the theoretical framework because I think this is really useful context for your question. So Ryan asked me whether I had a theoretical framework, and to the extent that I had one, I would say it came out as a result of the literature review. So I was clear about my question. What the literature review did was enable me to identify some key themes, and essentially it was those key themes, which were motivations, methods and challenges, which underpinned the methodology that I adopted. So in terms of my methodology, I've said I chose to do a qualitative research study. I wanted to adopt, or I did adopt, an interpretivist perspective because I'm really interested in why people do things and in their view of the world. And what I wanted to understand was what the individuals that I was interviewing, and I should have said earlier that I ended up, because of COVID, the scope of my research was limited. Actually, I didn't do as much as I had planned to do, but I ended up with two very established, well-funded charity organisations based in the UK, one working in the UK, one working abroad, and I interviewed 3 people from each. That was all that they and I could manage in the circumstances, but one was the chair, one was the chief, so the chair of each of them, the chief exec of each of them, and then a person in each of them who was responsible for kind of performance measurement and quality, if you like. So I had 6 lots of interviews. So because I had an interpretivist perspective, and because I wanted my research to be inductive rather than deductive, so I wasn't interested in existing theory. I just wanted, in testing an existing theory. I kind of wanted to get a load of data, analyze it, and see what it said to me. And I was using the themes that I'd identified in the literature review, which were those 3 things: the motivations, methods, and challenges. I was using those as the framework, if you like, to look at the data that I collected. And again, I mean, this kind of work was, academic work was completely new to me. So a lot of this was, I don't think it would be honest to say when I sat down to write my dissertation, I had clarity in my mind about any of that, really. I knew my research question, I knew what I wanted to try and find out. And I read a lot. I had Saldana's book about coding. I had David Gray's book about doing research in the real world. I read a lot of that kind of material to help me work out what approach would suit me. And in the end, having decided that I was going to do a qualitative study, and I decided on doing my semi-structured interviews, I guess the next big thing then was to understand how I was going to look at the data. And having read lots about different coding methods and looked really closely at the sort of data I'd collected, and thinking about back to my research question, because I think you have to just keep going back to your research question, I decided to do a thematic analysis. And I'd read in a paper somewhere that a theme captures something important about the data in relation to the research question, and that seemed to really chime with me. I thought, if I can develop those initial themes that I identified in the literature review, and build on those, that will make the data tell me something, which actually did work for me. And what I ended up doing was started with my 3 main themes. I had my typed transcripts of my 6 interviews, which went into pages and pages and pages. Each person had an hour, although they varied kind of between an hour and an hour and a half, I guess. I didn't kind of ask people to stop, and if they wanted to talk to me, I was happy for them to tell me things. And they had the questions in advance, so they were all given the same set of questions, and there were some things that some of them spent more time answering than others, depending on what they thought was most important to them, which was absolutely fine with me. But I essentially had my themes, and then when I had my transcripts, I then broke down the themes into what were, I suppose, sub-themes, and then I broke those down into subcategories. And actually, if I whip down here a bit, sorry, I'm not moving much through my dissertation. I think I've got some examples in here. I think it's page 14. Bear with me 1 second. So here at the bottom of page 14, so for example, within the theme of motivation, I identified the sub-theme of aspiration, which was something I hadn't found in the literature review. And then I broke that down further, and within aspiration, I had themes of changing people's lives, reaching beyond the beneficiary. There's another example within the theme of challenges. I identified this sub-theme of longitudinal data. And then I broke that down further and had restricted funding and attribution. So I had an Excel spreadsheet with all my main themes, my sub-themes, and then my categories. And when I had that really then got me into a position where I could start writing up my findings. And the format of the report, actually, which I'll come on to into a moment, kind of followed that pattern. That's essentially, I had my 3 research questions, which were my key lines of inquiry, if you like, to address my overall research question. But the format of the dissertation, you'll see, because you've now got copies of it, is organised within those 3 lines of inquiry, and then it's set out in terms of the themes that I identified. You're more than welcome. Yeah, it was entirely qualitative. And I think that was one of the questions I did ask Sue, about whether I needed to put any numbers in. I didn't do that, and I wasn't required to do that. And the other thing that I did do a little bit of work around was whether any of the data, any of the answers, that was the kind of topics and subcategories that were coming out, needed to be prioritized or given more weight. And I did do a little bit of reading at the time around whether it's helpful to do that. And in the end, I thought it wasn't really helpful, because I only had 6 people. The same sorts of issues were coming out, and it didn't seem to me at all helpful to be saying, 5 out of the 6 agreed about this. It wasn't anything that could be kind of statistically significant or anything. So I kind of steered clear of putting anything in there about quantities of anything.
Okay, and we have a brilliant question from Lee. Is it mandatory that our project experiment be successful? For example, if I'm doing machine learning and I take 51% accuracy to be success, however, my dissertation experiment only achieves 30%, will I get a low mark because of that? Or am I able to get a high mark if I have a good presentation on my reports? Would you dare to answer that question?
I think when I was writing this, and I have a very patient partner who I was, kind of saying, oh, I'm really having trouble with this, and so on and so forth. And basically he was saying, I don't think your supervisor is going to be particularly interested in your charities. What they want to see is that you've done a reasonable piece of research, that you've identified a research question, you've done a literature review, so you've understood where your research question sits in the context of other research that's been done, that you've had a way of gathering your data, that you've analysed it, and that you've applied some intellect to drawing some findings and conclusions from that. So I don't think I can answer that. I mean, because that sounds like it was a quantitative research question. I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that, but I do think the main thing is that you can show you've done a rigorous piece of research which has resulted in some original thinking or some finding. And I don't believe there's any problem in research confirming something that's already known, or finding some, I mean, that's perfectly legitimate. I mean, I think I was quite lucky, because in the end I did find something which is a little bit different from what I've seen in the research. But maybe that was just because, my particular research question hadn't been asked by other researchers. So I'm not sure I've been very helpful there. Again, I think that's one for someone who knows more about quantitative research.
No, Caroline, I definitely agree with you. And I think Lee is giving you great opportunity, because if it doesn't have the success that you've defined success, then you explaining why not and what can be done to achieve that success. That gives you an excellent avenue to be much more critical. So just because it wasn't successful, you can explain why it wasn't successful, what needs to be done to make it successful, what are the conditions and so forth that will help the success. I think it gives you a great opportunity. And once again, I think that's a discussion with your supervisor as well. We got, I can say we got 2 more questions. We got a lot more questions. Was there already was there already research, and did it deter you? If yes, how did you overcome it? So I assume, like, was there already literature within? Was there already this type of area covered?
Yeah. So I think you'll be really lucky to find a topic where something hasn't been written about it, to be honest. So yes, there was a lot of research about performance measurement in the charity sector in the UK, and also a lot in terms of US research, and that was quite scary in the beginning. And one of the things that when I was doing my literature review, one of the the kind of doubts I had was, you know, am I trying to do something that's been done before? Am I missing it? Am I missing it? Have I not found the paper that's already described it or talked about it? And, you know, I was really worried about kind of coming up with something and claiming it was an original thought, and then somebody saying, well, no, somebody else wrote about that, you know, 2 years ago. So I think they're all the usual concerns that people have. I think you just have to, as I said earlier, I think you have to be quite focused about how you search for the papers and the material that you want to look at, and just really apply your mind to what those papers are saying. And I found that quite hard in the beginning, as I said, but as the weeks went by and I was looking at more and more papers, I was, after a while, by looking at the abstract and the conclusions, I could see whether there was something there that was relevant to mine, and also it became obvious that actually there wasn't anything I could find that was doing quite what I was trying to do, which was going back to my original question, which was to look particularly at this relationship between performance measurement and impact in particular, and charities' purpose. So there was a lot of stuff about how charities seek to measure what they do, but I couldn't find anything that related it directly back to what their charitable purpose was, which is what I was particularly wanting to look at. So I'm just going to finish up on your data analysis, which were things which were helpful to me. So make sure you stick to your research question. You'll have lots of data. A lot of it will be really interesting, but it won't actually be relevant to what you're doing. So you've got to be quite strict about kind of putting to one side, maybe for later, or for another piece of research, things that don't relate directly to the question that you're trying to answer. I found that I used a lot of stuff that I'd learned during my studies in other modules at Birkbeck for this course. So I drew on subjects from things like organizational theory. I looked at stakeholder theory, you know, things like resource dependence theory. So I really tried to kind of capitalize on what I'd learned in my other modules, aspects of corporate governance. I did a business philosophy and society or something. I can't remember exactly what it was called, but we talk about corporate moral agency and ethics, corporate ethics. So I really did. And I quite enjoyed that. I quite enjoyed trying to inform my dissertation from things that I'd learned in the other modules. So I'd really encourage you to do that. In terms of the findings, you will see how I've arranged my findings. I didn't have separate findings and discussion sections. I just had one, which was findings and discussion. And that was presented as a response to my 3 lines of inquiry, I think I called them earlier. So my 3 kind of the 3 research questions that I'm going to try and find them in my paper. The 3 research questions that I felt would answer my big question about, are we any good at doing good? So my dissertation is organised around those 3 research questions, and each finding in relation to those 3 questions and the headings that I included afterwards was supported by direct quotation. So I should have said earlier, when I was analysing my data and sorting out my themes and my sub-themes and my categories, for each one that I thought was relevant to my research, I had a quotation. So at the end, I had loads and loads, hundreds of quotations from the 6 different people. And if I had, one of my challenges in writing up my findings was the word count. When you start this, you think, is it 12,000 words? I think it is. Isn't very much at all. But at the end, I had to cut so much out that I really wanted to keep in, because I couldn't fit it in within the word count. But I wanted to, I had a direct quotation from somebody for each of my findings, so there's a bit of an evidence base there. And I was able to kind of compare the 2 organisations and find similarities, but also some of the key differences in their motivations and approaches, which essentially is what led to my conclusions section. And in my conclusions, I felt very able to answer my research question. I came up with some new observations that I hadn't seen in the literature, which was great, and to kind of explore the different approaches that those charities had, in particular that their motivations were quite different. Both of them, actually, they had different motivations for doing impact assessments from the ones that I'd read about. They both had real challenges in doing it, which was something I had read about. It is a challenging area, but I understood better what those challenges were in relation to their desire to fulfill their charitable purpose. And also I was able to come up with some possible future topics for research, which I think is a good thing to do in your paper. The only other thing I would probably mention is that in terms of limitations, I think if we hadn't been in the pandemic, I probably would have had another organisation. So my original aim was to have 3 different organisations and far more people. And I'd also wanted, my intention had been to go and sit in on board meetings and kind of do a bit of observational stuff. But obviously I didn't have time to do that. I also wasn't able to talk to anybody who was a beneficiary of either of those charities, which I think is a weakness. And again, that was largely because of the pandemic. So, you know, I never had the opportunity to actually talk to people who were at the receiving end of the services of those 2 organisations, which was a shame.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I can hear you.
very well.
Okay, great. I'm actually doing the same. I'm doing inductive thematic analysis.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if did you look at latent themes or was...
Did I look at what, sorry?
Like latent themes, or I wanted to know how far did you go with, I guess, the interpretation of your data? Like,
I mean, that's a really interesting question. What I did was I made my framework essentially started from what I'd seen in the literature review. So the literature review really focused in terms of impact assessment on those 3 areas of motivations, measures, methods, and challenges. So that's generally what researchers were writing about. Why organisations do it, what drives them to engage in performance measurement activities in the first place, how they go about doing it, and the challenges to doing it. There wasn't even very much about kind of responses to those challenges. I found a few papers by people who kind of suggested that charities might do it this way or that way, and a few kind of models for doing it. But generally speaking, they were the 3 areas. So when I started doing my data analysis, I thought the easiest way for me to do this, actually, when I started looking at what was in my transcripts, was to kind of say, well, this is what we know. This is what the research is telling us. I'm going to start looking at my data with those big headings, so motivations. And actually, when I started, you know, with my written transcripts, I had them in front of me. I had my different coloured pens. When I started going through them, I kind of excluded anything that didn't speak to one of those core themes. And where it did, I then just highlighted it. So motivations, methods, challenges, and then went through all of those and then tried to subcategorize them, which is what I did. And I found that a really interesting way of doing it, because when you have, you know, lots of people saying things about, for example, motivations, you will find that there will be different topics that emerge from that about what motivates them, and when you drill down, you can really get a sense of you know, the kind of the real meaning of their statements. And I just, well, I don't know if that's answering your question, but it was just a matter for me of drilling down. So starting with the big theme, going to a sub theme, and then categorizing that down further. And in doing that, I did find some things that I hadn't seen in the literature.
Yeah, that's currently where I am now with the coding. So trying to decipher, okay, these are the codes, and then, you know, themes, and then breaking them down into like sub themes. So I mean, I guess was your trick was like kind of like to focus on the observations that were not found in research in order to...
I didn't set out to focus on the things that weren't found. It was just that as I went through it, that's what I'm just, if you bear with me a minute, I'm just gonna... I'm trying to find some of, because I've got them all here. I'm trying to find what I didn't. I started off trying to have very, like, you know, codes that were like 1 or 2 words. That didn't work for me. And then I actually, when I went back to some of my coding guidance from those books I mentioned, you know, it was much easier to be coding things with phrases. So, you know, originally I thought this was going to be really easy. I'm going to be able to say, you know, 2 words will be a sub-theme. It actually didn't work like that. It turned out to be sentences or little bits of, you know, a kind of couple of phrases which captured what the person was saying, and in that essentially became a process of just honing it down all the time and drilling down. So I then did end up with a spreadsheet of themes, sub-themes, and categories, all of which had a supporting quote. Okay. So that worked for me. I mean, it may not work for everybody, and it really depends on what sort of research you're doing. And I guess if I had been, I mean, I only had 6 people, although I did have hundreds of pages of transcript, and it did take some time. I did have to work with a spreadsheet. I toyed with the idea of having, Ryan, I can't remember what it's called. NVivo, is it? I did have I did have a little look at NVivo, and I thought if I had any more than those 6 people, I probably would have tried to get myself an NVivo license, or asked BertBet to get me an NVivo license. The amount of data I had was manageable, but I think had I had, you know, a dozen people, I think it would have been really hard to do it the way I did it with just spreadsheet and paper.
Yeah, at the moment I have like 200 codes, so I'm just trying to figure out.
Wow.
200 what? 200 at what level?
Because I have like 14 participants. So
see, I think if you've got 40 participants, I think you probably need to think about getting access to NVivo.
Yeah, I have it. So I'm kind of going through it now. So I guess I guess the difficult part is going from the codes to kind of making them more, like, consolidating them.
Yeah, right? And that is hard. But I had I mean, perhaps COVID played to my advantage because I had much less data than you have. But stick with it, because the more you have, the richer it's, you know, your findings are going to be.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Talia, last question. Could someone please repeat what the TA books that were mentioned? What are the TA books that were mentioned earlier?
What, the analysis books? So one is Doing Research in the Real World by David Gray, which in my current, you know, in my work now, I still find really interesting and useful. And the other one was The Coding Manual for Qualitative Researchers by Johnny Saldana. If you're not sure about how you want to approach it, it gives you loads of different coding methodologies. And it also talks about which ones are good for which kind of research. So I did find that really useful. And it was actually that in the end made me think I'm going to just stick to the kind of themed approach.
Yeah, and a follow-up question from Georgina: which coding did you use from Saldana's book?
So Johnny Saldana talks about thematic analysis, and essentially that's what I did. I've got it here. There's a little chapter on thematic analysis, because coding is fascinating, and if there was anything that would make me want to be a researcher, I think it would be the opportunity to play about with some of these coding methodologies, because it's really interesting and quite exciting. But for me, in the time I had, and for the research that I was doing, just thematic analysis rather than complex coding was what suited me best. But it also talks about things like the second cycle coding and all of that. So yeah, I found that very helpful.
That's good. Yeah, Georgina said perfect. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, you could feel free to wrap up. Any last issues that you want to speak on? Go ahead.
So I'd say a couple of key messages for you guys. Use your BertBet dissertation manual, because it has everything you need in it to give you the structure for your dissertation. So I very early on made myself a kind of template for my dissertation, you know, with my headings in, so that I knew kind of, you know, with each section, and your manual will help you do that. Look out for systematic reviews. I mentioned that to you earlier. They're a really good source of other papers. So if you're having trouble finding literature on the area that you're researching. If you can find a systematic review, they always include loads of references which you then yourself can follow up. I've put here, don't get too hung up on coding methodologies. Choose the one that's best for you and that suits you and that you're most comfortable working with. And finally, I would say be patient with yourselves. This is, you know, I did have days when I just wanted to throw my hands in the air and call it a day, but you'll do well if you just stick in there and use your supervisor. I'd say get lots of sleep and eat properly. But other than that, Ryan, I don't think I can add anything, and I'm sure all of you guys will make a great success.